All right, so good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you may be joining us. Thank you so much for joining our second and final webinar in our two-part webinar series to commemorate Urban October. Ladies and gentlemen, our distinguished participants, we would like to thank you for making time to be with us today. As you may be aware, Urban October is a global month-long event initiated by the United Nations Human Settlements Program, UN Habitat, and the basic idea is to promote awareness, to promote participation, to foster knowledge generation, as well as international engagement on sustainable urban development. My name is Wanda Puri-Mwewa, Africa Lead for the Charter Cities Institute. And on behalf of the Charter Cities Institute, CCI, we are very excited and very pleased to be hosting this webinar today with support from UN Habitat. For those who may not be aware, Charter Cities Institute is a nonprofit research and advisory organization working to empower new cities with better governance to lift millions out of poverty. We are doing this by creating the ecosystem for charter cities, basically convening, mobilizing all the key stakeholders needed to ensure that new cities are well planned, that they're well financed, well built, and effectively governed so that we can leverage the rapid urbanization that's happening, especially across the global south, for human flourishing. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to be moderating this webinar. We do have a very fantastic lineup of experts organization that will be presenting various methodologies, data, tools on urbanization, on planning, on governance, and many elements to do with socio-economic indicators, especially at the subnational level. We are joined by Annie White, who is Director of Software Tools at the Harvard Growth Lab. Annie, I believe it's good morning to you. We are also joined by Hoodo Richter, researcher at the Mo Ibrahim Foundation. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
All right, and we have Tommie Thompson as well, our quantitative researcher at the Charter Cities Institute. Good afternoon, Tommie.
Good afternoon.
All right. We will be joined as well by Daniel Githira. He is trying to log in, but he is the data analyst at UN Habitat. So while we wait for Daniel to join in, allow me to just go over a few housekeeping rules as well as to outline the structure of our webinar today. So we will start with presentations from our distinguished experts. This will be followed by a Q&A session for about 25 minutes, where we invite all of your participants to engage with us, to join the conversation and pose your questions or provide your comments. Kindly note that even before we get to the Q&A session, we do encourage you to use the chat box to pose your questions or to throw in your comment as the presentations are ongoing. And lastly, I'd like to mention that this webinar is being recorded, and so it will be available for wider sharing afterwards. All right, so with that said, allow me to just briefly set the scene. So our webinar today, titled Data, Cities, and Inclusive Sustainable Growth, aims to delve into the realm of data-driven approaches and how they can contribute to fostering inclusive and sustainable urban development. With this session, our goal is really to shed light on some of the innovative initiatives to generate subnational data, or more broadly, just data related to urbanization. This session will be exploring some of the data gaps as well, what that means, the implications for policy targeting, implications for investment decisions, monitoring socioeconomic policy impacts as well. And ultimately, what does that imply or mean in terms of fostering inclusive and sustainable growth? And I have to mention that this conversation is very imperative, given that we do see deficiencies regarding the quality of data that's available, particularly in Africa, where many of our cities, as well as our towns, are lacking basic city-level data on GDP, for instance, on labor, on governance, on infrastructure, resilience, urbanization, and many other socioeconomic indicators which are needed to inform more nuanced analysis, better policy targeting, as well as just to allow for the assessment of the relative productivity and competitiveness of municipalities. So without much further ado, allow me to introduce our speakers. I will start with Tommie. By way of introduction, Tommie Thompson is a social science researcher with experience working on impact evaluations, randomized controlled trials, and international development projects. Before he joined the Charter Cities Institute, he was a government consultant evaluating large-scale USAID and Millennium Challenge cooperation projects in Africa, Latin America, as well as Southeast Asia. He was also a research specialist at the Busara Center for Behavioral Economics, where he led behavioral experiments to address poverty in Kenya as well as Nigeria. His research interests include conflict, urbanization, and the political economy of development. Tommie has a BA from the University of Chicago and a Master of Public Policy from Georgetown University. And he soon hopes to ride the entire New York City and DC metro systems in one day. On a light note, Tommie, over to you to take us through CCI's New Cities Map, an interactive map that visualizes urban planning and governance data on existing new cities. Over to you.
Thanks, Mona. Let me share my screen. Do you see it, the presentation?
Yes, we can see it.
All right, cool. So thanks for the introduction. Mona said, I'm Tommie Thompson. I'm a researcher at CCI, and I've also been the principal investigator for the New Cities Map, a flagship research output developed and financed by the Charter Cities Institute. Over the past 80 years, but especially within the 21st century, there's been a tremendous growth in the construction and planning of new cities. By new cities, we mean top-down, master-planned cities built completely from scratch on undeveloped or underdeveloped land. In the past 20 years, in just sub-Saharan Africa, there's been over 40 new cities built and planned. A quintessential example is Abuja in Nigeria. The Nigerian government built Abuja in 1991, and today it is one of the fastest growing cities on the continent with over 3.5 million people. Over an 18-month period, we looked for, researched, and cataloged every new master plan city in the world since 1945. Our goal was to create a present-day snapshot of the contemporary new cities wave. The new cities map includes two components. One, there's an online interactive map that's free to use and that can visualize new cities. Second, it's a data set with program and governance data on new cities. You can access both the map and the data at newcitiesmap.com. When you go to the website, you can play around with the map, learn more about new cities, and download the data. So why did we create this map? We believe that the new cities wave will be a tremendously important phenomenon for the future of human urbanization. Yet despite its importance, there's relatively little research on it. Most research are theoretical and conceptual, and scholars are largely critical of the new city construction. What this means is that there's a lack of guidance on how to build new cities effectively and sustainably. And it is this gap in knowledge that the new cities map was designed to address. In order to generate actionable policy research, we need to study new cities using rigorous high-quality data. We need to utilize large and quantitative social science techniques. And we need to estimate the social, political, and economic consequences of new cities on their surrounding community. All of this starts with rigorous high-quality data. And our goal was to put out a database that other researchers could use to motivate this type of research. That is actionable policy-oriented research developed by social scientists. Here's an example of some of the uses of the data. I just mapped new cities construction over time, and you can see that in the present, new city construction has really accelerated, especially in the global south. So we envisioned the new cities map to have two main uses. The first is research. You can use the data set either alone or in conjunction with secondary sources to answer a variety of research questions. You can better understand where new cities are being built, what their impact is on the community, how to improve them, and whether they are achieving the goals that they set out. The second use is to serve as a project repository to be used by policymakers and stakeholders and other city developers. The New Cities Map is one central location where anybody working on new city projects can go to learn about other similar projects and how to improve their own project based on past experiences. Here's an example of something we use the New City database to address. One of the principal criticisms of New City construction is that they tend to be PowerPoint projects. They're discussed a lot, but they're never actually built in practice. Using our data, we found that that's not true. Less than 4% of projects actually fail. The vast majority, over 90%, are actually built in some form. Here I compare our New City map with some of the existing New City databases. These existing databases were designed mainly by urban planners for urban planners. Our database was designed by social scientists for social scientists and policy researchers and optimized for social science research methods. But what does that mean? What did we do differently than the existing data set? And we did two things differently. First, we collected much more extensive data on each city. The existing databases tend to only look at the project name and their location. But we went further. We looked at their GPS location. We collected data on their project management. We collected financial data, data on their goal, marketing data. I think the most novel type of data we collected is the governance data. By governance data, I mean what kind of power does the city administration have? Can it set its own tax regime? Can it collect its own taxes? Can it set its own school curriculum, its hospital policies, and things like that? And the reason we collected that data is at CCI, we believe that effective cities are a combination of both good hard infrastructure and good soft rule. And to understand why new cities work, what do they work, what are the potential pitfalls, we need to not only look at the hard infrastructure, but the regulatory framework they exist in. And our data set allows us to analyze that with governance data. Again, compared to the existing databases, you can see that we collect substantially more variables and data. The second thing we did was we developed a rigorous and transparent inclusion criteria. Many of the existing data sets tend to be more ad hoc. It wasn't always clear why particular cities were included or not, and there wasn't great documentation. But to generalize inferences using social science research technique, we need to have a good understanding of the underlying population and data. And that means a well-defined inclusion criteria so that researchers know why we include a particular project and excluded others. For our data set, we identified 6 criteria to define a new city. Cities must have been announced from 1945 or after and have a population of 100,000 people or more, a targeted population. We did that because we wanted to look at large expansive projects, not just small residential communities or gated communities or things like that. Second, new cities need to have been envisioned as a city from the start with a top-down master planner. And third, new cities needed to have a mix of uses. We wanted to look at projects that have a mix of industrial, commercial, and residential uses. We didn't want to focus or include cities that were just industrial park or just company town. How did we collect the data? This slide describes the general data collection process, but broadly, we went to a region and we created a master list of every new city in that region. Then we filtered that list by our inclusion criteria to identify the new city. To be included in our data set, each city needed to have met the 1945 announcement date. And they also needed to have met 3 of the 5 other inclusion criteria. In the current data set, almost all of the cities meet the 100,000 target population criteria. There are a couple at the 95,000, 98,000 mark that we still included. And of course, we face data limitations and barriers. The first was data availability. The vast majority of new city projects take place in the Global South. And in the Global South, data is scarce and not well maintained. In the Global North, oftentimes these projects are described by government through official channels or by the developer. In the Global South, that's not so much the case. Second was the problem of access. Even when we knew the data existed somewhere, we couldn't access it because private developers who are heavily involved in new city projects don't like to publish their data publicly. And so it's always hidden behind this paywall or private sector veil, and we couldn't access it. And the third problem was the problem of interpretation. In the new city space, there's a lot of enthusiasm and optimism. And oftentimes developers would talk about things that may not actually reflect the realities on the ground or what they plan to do. And so data collectors, we have to judge the various sources. We have to say whether the data was accurate or whether it was just speculative marketing from the developer. In terms of source hierarchy, we prioritize the government sources, official sources, and the master plan. Master plan usually developed by the private developer. But since not all of the information was contained in those sources, we also had to rely on secondary sources, such as interviews and news articles. And even though private developers don't publish official public-facing documents for many of their projects and data, they do discuss it in some detail in interviews and news sources. And so we can get information from there. But the new city map is still work in progress. Due to resource constraint, we couldn't complete data collection for all the region. For Latin America, North America, and India, we've collected all of the data. For Africa, we've collected all of the data except the governance data. And for Asia, Europe, and all the other remaining regions, we only collected data needed to determine their inclusion to our inclusion criteria and to map them on the map. So at the very least, our map is accurate to all the new cities since 1945. But we plan to complete the data set pending new funding. Our first goal is to complete data collection in all of the different regions. But we also want to expand the data set. We want to look at cities under the 100,000 target population mark, at the 50,000 mark to 80,000 mark. Because even though those projects are small, based on past experience, they're likely going to grow into large 100,000 population cities. Second, we want to expand the data set to look at time series data. Right now, the data set and map is just a present day snapshot during the data collection period, 2021 to 2023. But the further we go in the future, the less relevant that snapshot will be. So we want to keep updating the data set with new cities being announced. And we also want to track cities that we already have, see how they change over time. And third, we want to collect deeper data on SDG framework. The reason that a lot of new cities are being built now, because governments are using them as an industrial policy tool to spur economic development and industrialization. And with that, they're putting a lot of these cities in special economic zones with their own special regulation. And we want to see how those regulatory SDG frameworks affect both new city success and national economic growth. And that's all I have. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Tommie. I have to say you didn't utilize your entire 50 minutes, but thank you so much. That was very efficient and quite insightful. You have highlighted a very interesting data initiative by CCI, just showing the new cities that have been developed. Something struck out for me, and I just wanted you to clarify. Did you say less than 4% of new city projects have failed?
Yeah, since 1945.
Wow. Okay, that's
the number is slightly higher if we look maybe at the past 20 years. I think like something like 80% have succeeded, 20% have failed.
Okay, no, that's really fascinating.
Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, again, just to encourage you to post your questions, comments in the chat as we go along. We're going to move to our next presenter, and Daniel Githira has joined us. Good afternoon, Daniel. Can you hear me?
Yes, Wanda, good afternoon. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, loud and clear. Thank you so much. By way of introduction, Daniel is a data analyst working with the data and analytics section of UN Habitat. He offers support, training to countries, regions, and cities in urban data generation, data tools development, capacity building for SDG monitoring and reporting, implementation of the global urban monitoring framework, as well as linking data to action. He is currently working with over 50 cities across the world on localization of SDGs. With regard to his educational background, it's in the fields of geoinformation science and Earth observation, urban and regional planning, as well as project management. He has interests in urban performance indicators, urban data and modeling, GIS, and remote sensing, as well as development of data processing, automation tools, and undertaking research on sustainable cities. And over the last 14 years, Daniel has worked as a consultant urban planner, as a GIS analyst, data analyst, as well as project manager, not only for private organizations, national and local governments, but non-governmental organizations, as well as international organizations. Daniel, with that introduction, let me throw it over to you to take us through some of the urban data initiatives being developed and used by UN Habitat to support sustainable development, urban development. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mwanda, and thank you so much for inviting us, UN Habitat, to participate in this Urban October webinars. Yeah, as has been introduced, I'm a data analyst working with UN Habitat, the data and analytics section. And I'll just take a few minutes to give you an understanding on how we deal with urban data, the urban data trends, and the data initiatives. So I hope my screen is on full presentation mode.
No, it is not.
Yes,
We can see it, but it's not on
It
full presentation mode.
it should be now, right?
Yes, it is. We can see your notes, but it is on full presentation mode.
Okay, so I can
But you can go
proceed.
ahead. Yes, please go ahead. You have 15
Okay,
minutes.
thank you so much. Yeah, thank you. I'll take the 15 minutes. Yeah, so I'll start first by giving some background on what we do within the data and analytics section. So within the bigger UN Habitat work, looking at sustainable urban settlements, we focus on data. So this is a unit that deals with urban data. Yeah, so we see how we can support cities with the urban data, a generation of urban statistics for SDG monitoring, also development of tools, urban observatories, which I'll also mention about. We also develop a lot of capacity to cities and urban areas which want to generate their data for urban monitoring and also for decision making. As you realize, there's generally a gap between data and decision making for cities. So this is a part of the areas that we intervene on. And then I'll also mention something about how we integrate emerging technologies within our data platforms and how we disseminate this to the cities and also to the reporting component. Yeah, so this slide is just to overemphasize the importance of the cities. We know this is where the GDP come from, but also a lot of challenges from the cities because there is waste pollution.
Sorry, Daniel. Sorry, not to cut you short. There's something that has popped up. Give subtitles a try. I don't know if there's a way we can minimize that, close it so that we can see the slides properly. All right, much better. Thank you. Please proceed.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, so I'll first give some data trends on part of what we do is to try to understand the trends of data, particularly the urban data. And we just recently had the synthesis report presented to the high-level political forum. So this is the synthesis on Goal 11, looking at how cities are doing in terms of realization of SDG 11. And some of the trends that came out from this report and discussion is as you can see there, that we are quite far from the realization of the 2030 goals. And looking, for example, at goal 11.1, you can already see that Sub-Saharan Africa, they are showing quite a poor performance, looking at the target against where we are. And for the other indicators as well. So the key takeaway here was that we are still far away from the realization of the targets. And you can see Sub-Saharan Africa is notably quite far from the target. If you look at another insight from this data, this is also data that we generated from the synthesis work and also the World City Report. And you can see that the urban densities are showing to be very high in Asia and Africa, where we have the big cities. For example, in Europe and America, you see the densities are quite low. So if you overlay this with another data layer, for example, data on informality, what you see is that the Sub-Saharan Africa and Asia has got a lot of informal settlements. So if you overlay that with data on the densities, then you start seeing the challenge that you're facing within the region of Sub-Saharan Africa. So looking at other data insights, for example, this one is on fertility. So this gives another data trajectory, which shows you that while these areas have got the highest density, the highest levels of informality, also the blue ones which represent Sub-Saharan Africa, these are the countries which have got high fertility rate. So we are seeing now an increase in population as projected within these areas, again followed by the Asia region. So another insightful data point I would want to highlight is mortality. You can also see now when we go to the challenges side again, we see a lot of challenges on mortality, highest countries with the highest mortalities being most of them in Sub-Saharan Africa, then followed by Asia and a bit of Latin America. This one is again on the households, the congestion within the households, and you can see generally. So this is all to bring together just this message that we have urbanization happening in the areas which are receiving much of the challenges, much of the pressure is the region, for example, in Sub-Saharan Africa, followed by Asia and Latin America. So I'm going to focus on the data initiatives that we focus on at UN Habitat, the data section. And first, I'll highlight that what we do is we look at data that will help cities understand their performance over time, also diagnose their needs, and how we can support cities generate data that can be used for SDG reporting, SDG monitoring, and also, as I mentioned, informed decision making. So one of the frameworks we apply is called the Urban Monitoring Framework. This is a framework that was endorsed by UN Statistical Commission for implementation at the global level. And how this framework was developed is that it brought a lot of stakeholders together to harmonize all existing frameworks into one framework that would look at overall city performance and generate a diagnosis for the city, so that if you apply it for your city, for example, if it's Lusaka, then you're able to identify the domains which are weak and the areas which you can be, where investment should go into. And in a graphic form, this is how the framework works, where we have the baseline data. So we start with a process where we guide the cities through the generation of the baseline data on a set of indicators. The framework has got 77 indicators. So you start with the indicators, then you generate the baseline data, and then you look at the targets. The targets could be national, the targets could also be the global targets as defined by the SDG framework, and then you can identify the gaps which are there, and then you're able to use this framework for decision making and prioritization for the cities. Yeah, so we are working with so many countries and cities to implement this. And I'm just giving a screenshot here on the implementation we did for Kigali, where we could identify using this mapping. We take a lot of data, we scale the data so you can compare one indicator with another. And you could identify, for example, the challenges for Kigali. The pressing ones were on education, fixed internet, and also, for example, the youth employment, which was a challenge. So we have about 20 cities already implementing the framework, and we have very exciting reports that you can have a look at. So these are very key tools which helps a city understand their needs based on a comprehensive framework without overlooking some components, because this is a data framework which is quite comprehensive. Another data tool that I want to mention is on the Urban Observatory. So we support countries also establish urban observatories in urban areas and regions. So the Urban Observatory is a network of stakeholders that come together. They come together to work on data generation for the city, for the urban area, for the region, also for the country. And this data is used for decision making. This data is connected to the framework of the city in terms of the reporting. We have the reporting of the SDGs at the local level, which is through the voluntary local review. So this is part of how we support the cities. And then we have the certification process, as you can see, within one of the snapshots there, where we work with the city to identify the gaps, and then we can certify the observatory for to join the GUO network. The GUO network is the network of observatories that share experience, and implementation of this has been ongoing. We have quite a number of observatories. Some of them are national, others are local, others are regional. And you can see there, and we have a whole guide on how cities establish observatories. So I also want to mention another tool that we support so much with is the geospatial data work, where we support in understanding a generation of data to start with. So we generate data for cities, and then we share this data with the cities to validate, and then they can integrate the data into their decision making and also reporting, and also use this data for SDG reporting at the global level. So, for example, the good thing with the geospatial data is you're able to have a spatially informed decisions, where you can identify even areas which do not have access to, for example, open spaces, do not have access to public transport, and also urbanization trends. So this is also a very key area where we have a lot of investment on. And then we also have another stream of work on vulnerability mapping. So vulnerability mapping focuses on overlaying of data layers for urban areas, for example. You could take one city and then you have data on access to services. You have another data point on the vulnerability on flooding, and then you're able to identify areas which are more prone to risk, which are more vulnerable. And this is very useful in decision making and guiding decision making for urban areas. And we also work with communities to collect data, community data. So this is data generated by the communities. It could be open data, it could also be survey, which are supported by organizations. And with this data, we are able to overlay and connect this data with decision making for small areas. For example, it could be an informal settlement. It is not enough to say that an informal settlement lacks services. You can go into the depth of understanding which areas are more prone to poor services, which areas have more disadvantage, and using these kind of tools, you're able to go into a very granular level to identify these challenges with the cities. Another invention, another tool that I want to mention is the Earth Observation Toolkit. This is a toolkit that brings together a lot of data producers on urban data, data on sustainable urbanization. So we coordinate with a lot of stakeholders to bring together is a platform that is accessible from our data sites, and we connect cities to this platform where they can study the urbanization, they can study different approaches, for example, how they can define the urban areas, how their cities are sprawling, the air quality data. So this is more like giving them access to the data sources. And one of the tools that I highlighted to mention is this one called the degree of urbanization. One of the things you're going to realize is when you take, for example, the city of Lusaka, you're going to realize that urbanization is happening outside the administrative units. So if you're focusing on monitoring what is happening within the city, you miss a lot of what is happening outside. So we have developed tools which we implement together with the European Commission on how you can define your city based on the degree of urbanization. You look at how urbanization is happening, and then you can have these functional urban areas. And this has been very, very useful in generating comparable urban data for most of the urban areas. And we already have this implemented in 13 countries, and we are in the second phase where we have other countries which will be onboarded. Yeah, so another thing I want to mention is the processing tools that we generate. We support with a lot of data tools generation, for example, computation of the housing indicators from this DHS mix and census data. And then we also have cloud computing, for example, where a city wants to understand how the urbanization is happening. We have platforms like the Google Earth Engine, which supports in understanding where you can put your indices and generate all these indices and get the outputs. So if a city wants to do reporting, a country wants to do reporting, for example, it's very hard to report at the national level because you have so many cities, and we have like tools that could help you identify a sample of city that you could use to report based on a scientific sampling approach. Yeah, so just to also mention some of the data gaps we identify through our work is that some of the regions have got very huge data gaps, and we were recently profiling capital cities which have city websites and data portals, and we realized that looking at Africa, you can see the red showing there's no data published by authorities on their websites, even for the big cities. But then this changes as you go to Asia. You see the situation is changing on the capital cities in Asia, but when you go to Europe, the situation changes dramatically. So we can see the gaps which are there in sub-Saharan Africa in terms of data and also in terms of the performance. Another one I would mention here is this is data on transport, which is called the general transit feed specification. And you can see also the gaps which are there. You can see quite a lot of data there in America, Europe, Australia. But then when you go to where the densities are high, for example, sub-Saharan Africa, you see the data is very scanty. Yeah, so these are just examples on what you can derive from the data that you generate. And finally, I just want to mention that we have a huge database that we call the Global Urban Indicators Database, where we collect a lot of urban data. And this data can be generated from the cities to us, but we also look at the capacities of the cities. We can support them in generation and computation of the data. Then we share with them to validate and own the data. But we do not own city data that does not come from the cities. We just use that to analyze the trends of the data, because the cities are responsible for generation of their own data. Generally, we have other initiatives on data, but generally I want to highlight those ones as the key ones which support urban areas in generation of data. And we work with very many cities and almost all countries globally through these processes. So I want to stop there and thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Daniel, for a very insightful presentation. I mean, you've highlighted quite a number of issues. I wanted to follow up with just a quick question around the SDG monitoring. I mean, SDG 11 speaks to cities directly, but if you think about the other SDGs as well, is data being collected at subnational level? Are we mainly relying on the various censuses, living standards, surveys that are done by the countries? I just wanted to clarify how you are monitoring the data that you're using for that?
Yes, thank you so much for the question. Yes, the goal 11 focuses primarily on urban areas. But we realize there are so many cross-cutting issues which happen within the cities, but also within the other goals. So this is the foundation of the Global Urban Monitoring Framework. So if you look at the UMF, which we call simply the UMF, it brings together all these other components which are touching on the urban, but existing, for example, other SDG goals. So if it is sanitation, air quality, all these components on governance and partnership, they're all integrated into the urban monitoring framework. So one of the challenges you highlighted is data is not available at the city level. So what we have is development of tools that can support generation of data at the city level. For example, the key informants tools we develop for the questionnaires for data that can be easily collected from that level. But we also have, for example, analysis of surveys. If you take, for example, data from DHS, you can filter components which are urban and you can generate urban statistics from the DHS data. But also field tools where we work with cities to develop tools to the field where you can pick the data from the field. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much, Daniel. Let me move to Annie White and just briefly introduce her as well. So she is Director for Software Tools at the Harvard Growth Lab. She has over 12 years of experience in sustainable development, research, and software products. Annie is interested in how digital products can help solve global development challenges. And at the Growth Lab, she's responsible for the development of the International Atlas of Economic Complexity, along with the various subnational atlases, working on not just the research itself to design as well, development and launch of these various data initiatives. Prior to joining the Growth Lab, Annie was the Director of Digital Products at Sustainalytics, a global environmental, social, and governance research and analytics firm. There, she successfully launched an ESG risk and analysis software platform used by analysts, investors world over. Before Sustainalytics, she was a policy analyst with the International Food Policy Research Institute in Washington, D.C. Annie holds a master's degree in development economics from the University of Glasgow, and she is a certified product manager and Scrum product owner. Annie, over to you to give us a demonstration of Metroverse, the urban economy navigator that was developed by the Harvard Growth Lab.
Great. Thanks so much, Mwanda. And hello to everyone. It's great to be here. I'm going to share my screen and show you Metroverse. Metroverse is a tool that we built at the Harvard Growth Lab. It's considered a prototype tool. And the goal of Metroverse is really to help policymakers, industry leaders, investment promotion organizations determine the unique growth opportunities and diversification opportunities that exist in their cities. And this kind of gets to a growth paradigm that we have at the Growth Lab, which says that we sort of take a capabilities approach to growth pathways in various locations, including cities, which says that a place's or a city's technological capabilities or its know-how strongly informs what it's able to do next. And we'll see how this is illustrated in the tool as we go. So what you're seeing in front of you right now is the landing page for Metroverse. And my first task is to pick a city. And right off the bat, we see this visualization of the tool's coverage. So the prototype version of Metroverse covers 79 countries around the world and just over 1,000 cities. So it has okay global coverage, but not extensive global coverage. And sure enough, what you can see when you look at this map is a lot of the coverage we're missing is indeed across African countries and cities. A little bit of missing coverage gaps across the Middle East as well and in Australia. So this, as what you'll see as we sort of go through the tool is how good coverage and bad coverage sort of plays out in the stories we're able to tell and the analysis we're able to do on these cities. The tool uses Dun & Bradstreet data on firms and employee count. The most recent year for the data we have is between 2021 and 2022. The data is recorded for over 100 million establishments around the globe. We clean and aggregate the data at the Growth Lab and then use it to inform our digital tools and our data visualizations, and certainly what we use to power Metroverse. I'm going to come in here today and choose a city. And I think for the purpose of this presentation, it'd be great to show Johannesburg for the presentation. So when I choose a city right off the bat, I'm asked to whether I want to explore the city's profile or whether I want to explore similar cities. Both options are great. We'll start with a city profile today. Before I get there, what I'm doing right now is just zooming in all the way down to Johannesburg. And some of you might notice that when you examine the city boundary of cities in Metroverse, they might look a little bit different than what you would expect. And part of the reason is because when we were building Metroverse, we had to ask ourselves, what is a city? Cities are not exactly defined the same way across the world. I think that was alluded to a little bit in the presentations prior to this one. And so for the sake of consistency, we had to define city boundaries the same way across every city covered in the tool. And to do that, we took a measurement of population concentration combined with a measurement of the built environment concentration. And when we combine those two things, if that concentration sort of meets a certain threshold, we call that area kind of part of the urban environment. For anyone who's interested in a little bit more detail on how we did this, we explain it further here. So today I'm going to get into the city profile of Johannesburg, and we'll try to save a little bit of time for similar cities as well. So right off the bat, I come to this nice summary page. Our intention here was to say, well, if your whole analysis stopped here for the city, we hope that we would give you some interesting takeaway points and sort of a nice overview. In the tools we build at the lab, we always try to give a measurement of data quality. And this is because we know that even when we have good data and clean data, it's never perfect. And so we want to just sort of provide these disclaimers to people to say that we go through this process of rating data, in the case of Metroverse, high, medium, and low quality. What's really nice is that Johannesburg has what we consider medium quality data. It needs to be taken sort of with a little bit of caution, but by and large, we find it to be rather trustworthy. So Metroverse is organized here on the left-hand side according to this sort of 5-part narrative. And we start with asking ourselves, well, what is the city's composition, its economic composition? If you recall just a little bit earlier, I was saying at the Growth Lab, we take a capabilities view to growth and development in countries, cities, regions, and so on. So we say it's really important for us to know what you can currently do in your city or where your know-how exists or where it clusters. That strongly informs what will happen or where growth opportunities are next. So in Metroverse, what we use to obtain this kind of measurement of know-how is using employee counts by sector. And so what you're seeing here is a tree map of Johannesburg's economic composition broken down by sectors, down here indicated by the colors at the bottom. We try to give people as much ability in Metroverse to customize their data visualization depending on what you're trying to get at. So if you come into Viz options here, you can see that you can aggregate the data all the way up to the 1-digit level or the sector level. And sure enough, what you see in Johannesburg is that the majority of its urban economy is professional and business services, manufacturing, trade and transportation. A little bit happening in natural resources as well, hospitality and leisure. But we can disaggregate this data to all the way down to very, very granular levels. So sure enough, when you go down to the 5-digit level, you see it's not just professional and business services, but that's largely made up of management consulting services. So we'll stay at the 3-digit level for now. One thing we wanted to do is also give people an idea of how that composition plays out according to years of education. So it's one thing to say that you have all of these sectors represented in your city, how does that play out in terms of the years of education these particular sectors require? And here we colored the tree map not by sector this time, but all the way to purple here for sectors that require a high education and lower education industries here in green. We've taken a similar approach to hourly wage. So here we're saying this tree map is colored and the industries are colored according to whether they have a higher hourly wage, all the way in red down to blue, which is lower hourly. So it's good to know in your city whether that economic composition is composed of higher education industries that require a higher education and perhaps thus pay a higher hourly wage, or the opposite. We also know that people come in here and they say, hey, it's not really any of I don't care about all of the sectors in my city. I really want to know just about one. And so you can isolate those as well and do a bit of analysis sector by sector. And sure enough, here you see that leisure and hospitality in Johannesburg, we estimate is about 128,000 employees out of a total 3.9 million. Okay, so we start to establish this understanding of, okay, well, what is the composition, the economic composition in Johannesburg? And then we wanted to say, well, how does that compare to my peers? Because it's one thing to say, well, I have certain industries in my city, but that tends to be relative in terms of its concentration of employees. And so we wanted to provide these relative measures in the tool. And so here you can see that what I'm measuring now, and I'm just going to actually go up a digit level. So here I'm saying that industries that fall sort of at this 1x and higher measurement on the x-axis are industries where Johannesburg kind of has this outsized presence. I think here for mining, quarrying, oil and gas extraction, that usually is not happening actually in urban areas. I think what we would find probably is that it's support activities. Exactly. So it's probably the offices. Insurance carriers, miscellaneous manufacturing, a little bit of mining activity, air transportation, social assistance, accommodations in leisure and hospitality, and so on. And then to the left are the industries where Johannesburg doesn't really have this outsized concentration of employment vis-a-vis its peers. We wanted to give people the option to change their peer group at any time. So we always default the peer group to those cities around the world that have a similar population, in this case to Johannesburg. You can change this though. You can come in and say, I only care about cities that have a similar economic structure to the city I care about, or you can compare it to every single city in Metroverse, regardless of its GDP or its population. You can also do a city by city benchmark as well. So we give those options. We always default to peers by similar population. We also see that while we're comparing here in a relative sense, so we're comparing Johannesburg's concentration relative to its peers, we can also get an absolute sense of that employee breakdown as well. So here we're seeing on the left-hand side, Johannesburg's employee count or its employee concentration, sector by sector. And you can see once again that compared to its global peers that have a similar population, it really has an outsized concentration in manufacturing, professional development, services, a little bit in financial activities as well. And we can drill down here. So if I really wanted to know, okay, financial activities is a sector that's has a good presence in Johannesburg, what exactly in finance activities? And I can go all the way down here, and it looks like it's mostly insurance. So we give you that ability to start to really sense where does know-how exist in this city? And not only that, where does it exist relative to my peers or in an absolute sense? Okay. One of the most powerful tools in Metroverse is this data visualization we call the industry space. So the industry space kind of has this look of a brain. And inside of the data visualization, you see all of these colored circles. Some are gray, some have a color according to the sector. And these circles or these nodes are not randomly placed in the industry space. They're co-located in a very particular way. And that's based on whether or not they have sort of that shared know-how compared to the industries around them. So if I come here over to the manufacturing cluster, I'll zoom in a little bit here. Here we have let's look at in motor vehicles. So lawn and green tractor, home lawn garden equipment is very closely related to industrial trucks. The capabilities to build one are very similar to what you would need to do the other. Over here, we have truck and trailer manufacturing, other transportation equipment. So it's no surprise that these industries or these nodes are very, very closely clustered together because they share a lot of the same know-how or technological capability to produce. Unlike, for example, if I came out here, we know already that Johannesburg has some activity happening in finance. This finance cluster is rather far away from manufacturing, as we saw at the top, because it's very unlikely that the skill set required to build tractors and trailers, for example, is shared with the skill set to perform some of these financial industry capabilities. So the industry space is meant to tell us two things. One, it's meant to tell us where does knowledge cluster in my city today? And we can see that based on some of this clustering happening over here, up in, let's see what this is if we zoom in. Yeah, so up in mining and oil and gas, I think a lot of that is probably support services in the city, a little bit in manufacturing and finance as well. Just by point of comparison, if we compare Johannesburg, for example, to a city like, I don't know, let's choose Boston. It's one that I'm quite familiar with. We can see a completely different clustering pattern happening. So indeed, the industry space takes on the same shape. The nodes are located in exactly the same place, but where that concentration of clustering is happening is somewhere different. So in the city of Boston, it's less about manufacturing, but we have a lot happening here in healthcare, government, public services, and indeed finance as well. Okay, so that pattern of clustering or where that know-how exists in a city is very different depending on where you are. And so we don't take this one size fits all approach to the possibilities that exist next. I'll just show one very interesting interaction in this tool. So we said, okay, well, there's financial activities happening in the finance industry in Johannesburg. So I can zoom in a little bit here. And sure enough, I know that, for example, health and welfare funds or direct life insurance carriers are industries that have a high presence in Johannesburg. If I click on this node, it takes me to this next sort of data visualization underneath all of it. And what it's showing me are the industries that are nearby to what I already know how to do. And what that's meant to represent is the possible or the adjacent possible next industries that I might consider as a policymaker or as an investor to move into. If I already have in my city the capabilities to perform direct life insurance carrier activities, then it's very likely those skill sets can take me into commercial banking, direct health and medical insurance carriers, and so on. So that's a very sort of unique profile that would exist in Johannesburg and potentially not in another city, even another city very close by to Johannesburg. So we really wanted to illustrate in this tool that a city comes with a certain set of know-how and a certain sort of set of technological capabilities, and we can start to drill down to what's very close by to what I already know how to do, and thus industries I might move into next and diversify. Finally, at the end, we sort of try to spell this out a little bit more. So we take those adjacent possible industries that we saw in the industry space, and we plot them in this SWOT diagram. So here at the top, we see the strengths, the industries that represent strengths in Johannesburg, industries that are a threat, a weakness, and an opportunity. For the sake of this presentation, I'll just sort of focus in on the opportunity. So these are industries where that relative presence vis-a-vis the city's peers is actually rather small, but we think that there's a high technological fit. So this is what's measured along this y-axis here. So technological fit means that that ecosystem to develop an industry exists in the city, and yet its presence is rather small. And we think that that combination represents opportunity in the city. And so here you can hover once again on these nodes and determine what some of these opportunities could look like. And what we hear from policymakers and investors is that this really helps to take a very customized approach to development, skill development, and investment opportunities in the city. I'll pivot right now to another section of the tool called Similar Cities. So this is in beta form, and so it's a little bit of an experiment. But what we wanted to get at in Metroverse is a way to compare cities in a really meaningful way. And we thought that one of the ways that we could do this is by showing cities that are similar to my own because we're competitive in the same industries. And as it turns out, I can be competitive in the same industries as a city across the world from me. So oftentimes in policymaking or in investment promotion initiatives, cities are compared to cities, other cities that are very nearby. And what we wanted to do is to show, well, around the world, you can have sort of these set of sister cities because they're competitive in the same industry. They likely share many of the same challenges that your city faces or have considered the same hurdles of development. And so when we come to Johannesburg, we think that some of the similar cities, again, according to industries that they share this competitive development with, for example, Cape Town, so there's one that is relatively nearby, but also Bogota and Colombia, also Wuhan, for example, and Dallas in the United States, Moscow in Russia. These 10 cities in this inner ring represent cities that have the highest similarity and then lower similarity in the outer ring. And so we wanted to present this set of similar cities to sort of give local policymakers a chance to say, hey, maybe it's not the city that's my neighbor I should be thinking about, but it could be cities halfway across the world. One of the challenges, again, with data coverage, we think, is that when there isn't sufficient or ongoing or high quality data disclosure, it's very hard to paint this picture accurately, hence why we call it a beta feature. I would imagine that if we had excellent coverage of African cities across the continent, this picture of similar cities would look a little bit different from Johannesburg. I bet there would be more African cities as part of this collection. But for now, we're drawing from the set of 1,022 cities that are actually in Metroverse. So I'll stop there. I'll just say that the tool we built it as a public good, so it's free for everybody to use. I'm sure Mwanda and the team will circulate these materials after, but we encourage everybody to access it, use it, and contact us if you need help navigating it.
All right. No, thank you so much, Annie. That was really insightful. I noted a few things. I mean, first off, it's great that you already, provide some sort of caveat about the quality of the data. I think it's always important to be transparent regarding the limitations and the quality of the data itself. But I mean, just to be able to visualize, to see the economic composition of the city, I think is really great as we speak about cities being engines of economic development and needing them to transition, to get into more complex products as they seek to transform their local economies. So thank you so much for that. I mean, I'm going to quickly move on to Hoodo. Let me just briefly introduce Hoodo. Last but certainly not least, in terms of introduction, she is a researcher at the Mo Ibrahim Foundation, an organization that measures African governance performance. And she leads research in participation, rights, and inclusion, as well as urbanization in Africa. She holds an MSc in Urban Economic Development from UCL Bartlett Development Planning Unit. And she has a BA in International Relations from SOAS, University of London. So Hoodo will provide a situational analysis of urbanization trends in Africa, highlighting some of the data initiatives by the Mo Ibrahim Foundation. Again, just to remind everybody, because I know we have gone through quite a number of presentations, so please use the chat to pose your question. Alternatively, you can wait as we get to the Q&A session. We'll be able to unmute you so that you can pose your question to our presenters. Otherwise, Hoodo, over to you to give us the last presentation.
Thank you, Mwanda. I'm just going to share my screen. So as Mwanda said, my presentation is going to be looking at unpacking urbanization in Africa, specifically looking at the key facts and figures, the challenges, as well as the opportunities. To start off with, I think it's important to look at urbanization from a global perspective and see how Africa fits into that story. So you may know that more than half the global population live in urban areas today, and by 2050, we expect that almost 2/3 of the world are expected to be living in cities. The chart below shows world regions and the percentage of population living in urban areas in 2020 and 2050. And as you can see, Africa is the least urbanized region in the world, with 43.5% of the population living in urban areas in 2020. On the flip side, you can see that North America is the region that has the most people living in urban areas at 82.6%. But by 2050, we estimate that almost 60% of the population in Africa will be living in urban areas, and this is 15% up from 2020. I think a key trend to also take from this chart is that highly urbanized regions such as North America, such as Latin America and the Caribbean, such as Europe, are also going to urbanize up to 2050. So I think it's key and I think this is also because the process of urbanization is often considered irreversible. So I think it's key for African urban practitioners and policymakers to keep thinking about urbanization in their policies in the future, and certainly in the foreseeable future as well. So if Africa is the least urbanized region in the world, then why is urbanization such a big topic in Africa? Well, this is really down to the rate. This map shows the annual average urbanization rate from 2020 to 2025. The deeper red indicates a higher urbanization rate. And as you can see from the map, no part of the planet is urbanizing faster than Africa, not even historically. And when we think about looking at Europe, it took Europe about 110 years to move from 15% of the population living in urban areas in 1800 to 40% by 1910. Africa has managed to achieve this in only 60 years. So it's almost half the time. If we look at data looking at cities, 7 out of 10 cities with the highest expected annual average growth rate between 2020 and 2025 are African. And Nigeria's Gwagwalada is the city with the highest growth rate globally at 6.4%. So this is a city that had a population of has a population of just over 500K in 2023. And this has more than doubled in the last 10 years. So Africa is the fastest urbanizing place in the world. So where are people expect to be moving to? Well, we can expect the largest cities will continue to grow in the decades to come, and some are already larger than whole countries. So when you look at Cairo, which is the most populous city in Africa, it has a population over 22 million. And this is larger than the country of Chile. And by 2033, the population will exceed 27 million. Currently, Cairo is the only African city among the 10 most populous cities globally. But by 2033, we expect that Kinshasa in DR Congo will also join Cairo in being in the top 10. So if you look at the graphic on the right, you can see, as I said, Cairo is bigger than Chile. You can see Lagos is almost on par with the population of Cambodia, yet bigger than Belgium and Sweden. You can see towards the bottom, Khartoum is on par with El Salvador, the country. So I think this poses an interesting governance issue here, because how should these cities be governed? Should they be governed as countries, or should they be governed in different ways? I think it's clear that it's an open question still. Despite the largest cities growing, the fastest growing cities are smaller cities. In Africa, the fastest growing cities have fewer than 1 million residents, and there are more than 1,400 intermediary cities, which are home to 210 million people. Africa has 6,740 small urban agglomerations with fewer than 100,000 inhabitants, which are home to 180 million people. And the number of agglomerations hosting between 10,000 and 100,000 people has grown from 4,770 in 2000 to 6,740 in 2015. So you can only imagine what that number has grown to now, because this is quite an old stat. And of the 20 fastest growing cities globally between 2000 and 2020, 6 of them are considered African, and none of them are megacities. So really, African city leaders must not overlook smaller cities in favor of larger ones, and they have to prioritize these smaller cities and allocate resources accordingly. We're also seeing higher urbanization rates and population growth in areas, in coastal areas in Africa. Out of the continent's most populous cities, 8 are located on the coast, including 3 of the largest cities, Dar es Salaam, Lagos, and Luanda. 40% of the population in Africa's 20 largest cities also live in the coast, and the IPCC predicts that by 2030, over 100 million people in Africa could be exposed to sea level rise in low elevation coastal zones. So if I just show you this map on the right-hand side, you can see population living in low elevation coastal zones, and you can see the deeper blue signifies the higher the population that live in these coastal zones. And you can also see these little, well, kind of biggish circles are areas where there's a population of coastal people living there, or the cities. So you can see this is climate change will continue to be an issue here, and it's alarming that urbanization is taking place in areas that are highly vulnerable. So it really does mean that, you know, urbanization needs to be managed, but also African practitioners and city leaders need to prepare for this. Informality will also continue to be a growing challenge. Africa has 1/3 of the global urban slum population, behind Asia, which has 60.4%. However, Africa is the region that has experienced the largest growth in urban slum populations between 2000 and 2020. 1/3 of Africa's urban population live in slums or informal settlements, and this is greater than any region, including Asia, which is at 17.3%, Latin America, and the Caribbean. And this again really comes down to the preparation and preparedness and the good governance of governments in Africa. We're seeing that 90% of new urban development in Africa is currently informal. Roughly 2/3 of the investment in urban infrastructure needed by 2050 have yet to be met. But within our IIAG, there's a silver lining here, because we found that 35 African countries have improved in the IIAG affordable housing indicator between 2012 and 2021. So that's a good indication, but more needs to be done. So as we take these sheer numbers and sheer amounts of people that are going to be on the move in Africa, but also the sheer amount of people that are going to be on the move in these vulnerable areas and potentially living in informal settlements, there is an importance of good governance. Sadly, the 2022 IIAG showed a stall in governance progress in Africa, and this is mainly down to worsening security and democratic participation environments. Participation, rights, and inclusion, which is one of our main 4 categories, remains the lowest scoring IIAG category in 2021, with a score of 46.7 out of 100. And over 1/3 of Africa's population live in a country where participation, rights, and inclusion is declining at an accelerating pace. So really what this is showing is that governance in Africa is becoming less participatory, and this is already coming from an African governance which is often centralized with top-down decision-making, and this continues to weaken local leadership. So there really is a need for decentralization, transferring power, responsibilities, and finance from central government to local levels to strengthen capacity. Just as good governance is needed, there is also a need for better data coverage. Africa is still the world region with the lowest availability of reliable and up-to-date statistics. And we recently found that in 12 African countries, the latest census was conducted by 2010, or before 2010. So this includes Burundi, Cameroon, Central African Republic. Somalia in particular has conducted the latest census in 1987. So that's a very a long while ago. Admittedly, our own 2022 IIAG shows key data gaps, which include health capacities, mental health, rural sector, economic informality. But it's worth saying that our IIAG is a reflection of the data available. So if there are gaps in our framework, this is due to the gaps of the data that's available. Despite these challenges, African cities are outperforming the rest of their countries. 1/3 of Africa's GDP growth is due to urbanization, as cities continue to outperform their countries. Productivity levels are higher in cities compared with rural areas, reflected in higher wages for workers in urban areas. higher share of skilled jobs in cities due to there's a higher share of skilled jobs in cities due to higher education levels. Less than 20% of households in rural areas have access to electricity, while the share is 58% in small cities and 80% in larger cities. And 42% of populations in rural areas don't have any formal education, compared with only 13% in large cities. I think a key advantage that Africa has as well is that urbanization is taking place while Africa has the youngest population in the world. At 18.8, Africa's median age is by far the youngest in the world, 12.2 years younger than Latin America and the Caribbean, which is the region with the second lowest median age, and this will remain until 2100. Africa's share of global working age population will almost triple between 2023 and 2100, and by 2055, Africa could have the lowest dependency ratio globally, amounting to 3/4 of Europe's. Africa's share of the global youth population will also more than double from 20% in 2023 to 45% in 2100. This is people aged 15 to 34. And by 2085, Africa's youth will overtake Asia's in the world's largest. So really, there are some positives to take. And if there's anything that we know from other regions, we know that urbanization should lead to economic growth, should lead to economic development and better living standards. But Africa must manage urbanization to reap these rewards. And it requires decentralization, which is key, not just political, but also financial. It requires investment in education, training, and job creation, especially to empower the next generation. It requires establishment of vital infrastructure that meets needs of the population, such as affordable housing and efficient transit. And it also requires cities to be built and designed with climate change in mind. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hoodo, for giving us a great overview of the urbanization patterns in Africa, highlighting the challenges. One of the things that really stood out for me is the need to prioritize secondary cities as well, intermediary cities, not just focusing on the big cities. And so that's something really important that needs to be discussed. All right, so at this point, we'll open it up to our participants to join in the conversation. If you do have a question, you can go ahead and raise your hand and we will unmute you so that you can pose it. As we're doing that, let me start with the first question that we have received in the chat. So this is coming from Wusiku, and he's asking, what type of support is available for cities to generate data collection for their decision-making? Most cities might want this support, but might be constrained financially or technologically, or even human resource capacity. And I guess this question sort of cuts across to UN Habitat. Annie as well, you could weigh in on this, given the data gaps that you highlighted across Africa and how that too can be really relevant for the continent. And Tommie as well, you already highlighted some data constraints. We'll start with you, Daniel.
Yeah, thank you so much, Phil. Yes, so in terms of the support for cities, I start by noting that there's generally so much open data that is available today, more than cities could imagine, for example, on particular indicators. So we start by working with cities. If cities do not have data, then we support them in connecting with open data sources so that we can identify the gaps which are there. So our biggest support is generally on capacity. So capacity is what is lacking for most of the cities, because with the tools, you can really do so much with the very limited resources. We also encourage the use of open source data and open source tools. In some years, it was very hard to use GIS tools because we only had commercial applications. Today, you can tap into open source data processing tools, for example, the GIS tools, the statistical tools, which are very much available today. So and of course, where there are resources, there's also the possibility of data collection in the field. For example, using the open source Kobo Collect. Kobo Collect is an is a field ODK tool that you can configure and send teams to the field and collect a lot of data. Yeah, so before even we think about resources, there's already so much that we can work with cities to work on, and this we support on very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Annie, how are you working to support African cities to generate the data that's needed?
Yeah, so what we've heard from cities, not just in Africa, but also around the world, certainly in some developing areas, is that a lot of their data comes from federal sources in disaggregated formats. This is not ideal because it misses a lot of nuance in the city, but it's a good place to start. And it provides oftentimes just enough to get going with important insights. That said, for us to build a tool like Metroverse, we did have to rely on private paid sources of data in order to get sort of a bigger picture.
All right, thank you. Tommie, if you could weigh in on this.
Yeah, I think using kind of crowdsourced data is an avenue that could be used in a lot of cities, especially with kind of deproliferation of mobile data now, mobile phone. I remember we talked to somebody recently who's doing data collection for trees in Freetown, and they built a whole platform just on mobile data. They were able to collect fine-tuned tree data in the entire city, just crowdsourcing it. And so that's kind of a relatively lower cost way that many cities could try collecting more data.
Right, and then around capacity development, how do we build the capacity of, say, the subnational authorities to be able to collect this data? Any initiatives around that?
Oh, for me, I'm not familiar.
From anyone, sorry.
Sorry.
Yeah. Perhaps, Daniel, you could weigh in on this. I know you had talked about working with many governments already, so maybe emphasizing issues around capacity development, because the constraints go beyond just the financial constraints.
Yes, yeah, very much capacity is needed, and we normally send this data request to countries every few months, so that we see if cities have data on specific SDGs to support in reporting. And one of the feedback we get is we do not have capacity. We want to generate the data. Yeah, so we do have a lot of in-person trainings with countries, particularly the NSOs. So this is at the national level, where we go through the interpretation of the data, the metadata, because without this understanding, cities might even have the data, but without connection to the metadata, then the processing and generation of statistics is not possible. Yeah, so much of our support is through the national statistical offices, which again connects to the cities. Then we also have a lot of virtual trainings. And for example, these webinars are also very useful. We're also working with a lot of partners, for example, the European Commission, which is also supporting in generation of data for particular indicators. There are those indicators now generally, for example, on urbanization, there's so much data available there. So the only thing cities need to do is just a little capacity to understand what is happening in the processing. Yeah, so with very particular cases, we can guide a lot on how our cities can navigate through the challenge.
All right, thank you so much. I mean, I'm going to come to Hoodo and just pose a question around the governance indicators. I mean, because they're very insightful, but obviously they are generated at national level. So are there any efforts by the Mo Ibrahim Foundation to sort of, go a little bit more granular and start to collect data at subnational level so that we can get those more nuanced indicators around governance at that subnational level?
I mean, currently the index just gives scores and ranks to do with countries and at the national level. But I think from the top of my head, we do have some indicators or sub-indicators that look at urban affordability of urban housing. But I think we could potentially include more indicators at that level. But again, it's to do with our inclusion criteria, which limits us in a way, and also the fact that we collect data from a 10-year period. So I think it really just has to do with the data that's available. The more data that's available to us, the more we can include in our framework. So next year we will be collecting the index again. So hopefully we can have more indicators that reflect urban issues, but I don't see it going to the subnational level just yet, because it would still have to give a national score or rank.
Mm-hmm. All right, no, thank you so much for that. I mean, another question I wanted to pose, and any of you can take it up, right? If we're talking about inclusive and sustainable development, when I started, I alluded to some of the key indicators that are needed. GDP at national level, for instance, how do you access green financing? How do you get municipal bonds if you can't even measure the size of the subnational economy? So, you know, thinking about that, thinking about policy implications, if you could, or as you just briefly wrap up, because we're coming to the end of our webinar, just give me your thoughts around, beyond the data initiatives that you have, how do we scale up? How do we think about getting other necessary subnational data, especially in the global south, that's needed, not just to inform, you know, investment decisions, financing decisions as well at the municipal level. To be able to tap into some, you know, financing that's available, you need to be able to measure the size of your economy. So beyond that, and even just the labor data as well. I mean, speaking about my country, Zambia, you can get labor disaggregated to provincial level, district level, but trying to see even at, you know, the town level, city level, trying to demonstrate so many elements that cut across from the overall SDGs. What should we be doing? How can we think about this data challenge as we move forward? And I will start with you, Hoodo, and then move to Tommie, and then Daniel, you will close us off with your remarks.
I think getting more subnational data really comes down to decentralization and having the key institutions in place that are closer to the local communities that can gather that data. So I really think it has a lot to do with governance structures and making sure that it's a bottom-up process rather than a top-down, and kind of not leaving data collection just to central governments, making sure that the capacity is there for local governments to collect that data. I think, you know, that is the one thing I'm thinking about, is decentralization.
Yeah, I'm going to answer this from a research perspective, particularly as someone who's interested in doing kind of large and quantitative analysis. And I think Annie alluded to this, but really one of the things missing from a lot of subnational effort is there's not a good conceptualization of what a city is. And then maybe if you're just a particular city administration, you just want to learn about your own city, that's not as big of a problem. But if you're a researcher trying to do larger analysis, or if you're somebody trying to compare your circumstance with other cities around the world or in other regions, that type of conceptualization of what a city is really important. And I'll give an example. In China, there's often a statistic we throw around that China has the largest cities in the world by population. But really, that's an artifact of just the way they define their statistical areas. A lot of Chinese cities include vast areas of rural land around their core. And so when we compare, you know, population growth between different regions, we're really just capturing those artifacts rather than the actual underlying differences. And so for me, you know, moving forward, collecting better subnational data that's suitable for larger analysis, we should really start thinking about a way to unify definition of cities around the world in a way that's more useful for research.
Thanks, Tommie. I'm going to write on that as Daniel comes in, because I'm aware UN Habitat has been working around this issue of defining cities, trying to get a global definition that's obviously it needs to be contextualized, but can be applied, you know, lends itself to being comparable. So Daniel, as we conclude, you know, around the data gaps, around the sort of data that we need to be thinking of generating as well at subnational level, this issue of city definition, could you just speak a little bit to what UN Habitat is doing and how we can, you know, move to some sort of consensus on what a city is?
Yeah, thank you so much. So in terms of city definition, what we have is, as I mentioned, cities having their own interpretation of what is a city. So then it becomes very challenging to compare statistics, because if you define your cities differently, then how can we know how far you have gone in terms of realization of the SDGs? So there was this project that was supported by the European Commission, the GRC, and it led to the tool which is called the Degree of Urbanization, which was endorsed for implementation by the UN Statistical Commission in 2020. So what the tool does is that it looks at population densities, the contiguity of settlements. It also looks at the built-up areas, and then it gives you a boundary for your city. And this boundary, if you use it in one country and another country, you can be able to compare data. The only challenge here is that most of the urban data is available within administrative units. So if you have a value for Lusaka, then and the boundary that has been generated using this tool, degree of urbanization does not match exactly the boundary that you have, then it becomes very challenging to generate the data. So we are now having this program where we're moving around the countries, training them on how to use the tool, but also telling the NSOs that you can now start collecting your data based on these classifications, which are called the degree of urbanization classes. So moving into the future, this is an opportunity now we are giving to the cities to start working with. So this is how the tool is progressing, and we already worked with over 13 countries. And this one I can share information on. Yeah, so on the second question on the subnational data, yes, the biggest challenge is generally the structures which are there for data collection, data generation, and the platforms. So we go to countries where the Ministry of Planning has got this information, the NSO has got a different set of information. This information doesn't come together, so it becomes very challenging. So the city may have data, but no one is able to use the data because the data are disconnected. So we're also promoting this coordination of stakeholders within the cities, especially the data actors within the cities, so they can start working together to put the data together in a way that it can be used and also used to support decision making. And one of the tools we use is the urban observatory model, where the network of stakeholders come together within the city, including the government, the academia, and then we have a host that can host an urban observatory, and then all the data comes there. And it becomes very easy with an urban observatory, even in terms of raising the resources. You can pull the resources because you can even make a proposal to the government, and then all the data is hosted there. So it becomes very easy with this. And the last point I want to say is we also encourage cities to use non-conventional data sources. We have traditionally relied on the census data, but today we have so many non-conventional data sources. So if you can integrate this into our databases, and the urban observatory becomes very useful. Thank you.
All right, no, thank you so much for that. I think the takeaway words for me as we come to a conclusion is coordination, decentralization, and also having a common measure or common definition of what a city is. But obviously we've discussed so much more, and we have seen the various data sources that can be utilized. And I really do hope that all those that joined in will be able to make use of these data sources, and that they will share them quite widely, because I do believe the applications are quite vast. I want to thank you and Habitat once again for being very supportive of these webinars. I would like to thank our presenters. They were very fantastic. Thank you for making time to be with us and showcasing the various data initiatives that you have ongoing. I also want to thank the participants that joined us. As I mentioned earlier, this webinar has been recorded, so it will be available later on online and can be shared more widely. And last but certainly not least, to the team behind the scenes, Heba, Jama, Christy, and many others at CCI that have been working to support this webinar to ensure that it runs smoothly. Thank you so much for your commitment and support. All right, with that said, once again, thank you on behalf of the Charter Cities Institute. I wish you all a wonderful day or evening, and goodbye.